Very much. Right, now we're not going to mess around. We're going to get straight into the good stuff. We're moving into the effectiveness area. The next man up needs absolutely no introduction at all, but he's going to get one anyway, because I think he deserves one. Mr. Les Binet. He's the head of effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB. He's known across the world for his contributions to the field of marketing effectiveness. We believe that he's won more effectiveness awards than anyone else on this planet, and he's here to tell us from his latest analysis of the IPA data bank, where they, alongside Peter Field, he's dug into how their rules differ for different types of brands in different contexts. He's going to be digging into the world of financial services, so please put your hand together for Mr. Les Binet.
Very good. Hello. My rather silly job title is Head of Effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB. What that means is I think about how to make advertising more effective and how to measure it and how to make sure that we keep getting better at producing effective work. So that's kind of my day job. But I also have spent the last, 12 years or so working with Peter Field and the IPA to try and learn about how marketing works in general. What are the rules for effectiveness across different categories and so on. So we're very lucky in that Peter and I have had access to the IPA data bank, which is probably one of the world's best sources of data on effectiveness. They've collated information on, I think, about 1,500 marketing campaigns over the years, looking at what the strategy was, what the media used were, how the campaign worked, but crucially, what were the business results. And Peter and I have basically spent the last 12 years mining this data to try and answer these broad questions. You know, are there rules for effectiveness? What are the ingredients for effective marketing? And more recently, are those rules changing? Because obviously it's a very rapidly changing world. Are there rules that are constant, and what are the things that are changing? But what I really want to talk about today is this last question. How do the rules vary by context? Are there rules that apply to all brands, but are there some brands that behave differently? Are there some categories that behave differently? And today I want to talk about the financial context. Is financial services marketing, does finance follow different rules? So I'm going to kind of canter through the evidence that we have on this, but I first want to just start by outlining what I see as the central principle of our work of the last 5 years, which is this distinction between brand and activation. Now, apologies, some of you will have probably seen this before, but I think it's really important to reiterate this because I think this is the key principle that you need to understand everything else that we say. So, marketing can work in two very different ways, we believe. The first way is easy to understand. It's what we call sales activation. You might call it performance marketing or direct response or promotional marketing. But basically, the key to activation is it's marketing activity which is intended to produce a fairly immediate response. You want people to do something, and you want them to do something now or in the very near future. So it might be you want them to click on a link, or phone a number, or buy a product right now, or pop into the store right now, or visit a website. But you want people to do something fairly soon. Now, today, tomorrow, certainly this week. Now, when you're working in the activation space, you don't need to build up long-term memories. This is, think of this as, in psychological terms, this is short-term memory. You just want people to remember what you've said long enough that they will actually act. So when you're doing activation, you focus quite tightly on the people most likely to respond, and you prompt them in such a way that they will respond now or very soon. And when you get that right, you get big, obvious results. You know the kind of thing when you do, for example, DRTV, and you immediately see people ringing on the phone number or going to the website or responding in some way to a message which is immediately of interest to them and motivating. Now, when you get that right, as I say, the spikes are big, the ROIs tend to be high, it's efficient and it's profitable stuff. But there's a problem, and the problem is the decay curve. The decays tend to be rapid. Anyone who's worked in performance marketing will know that, again, if you're doing DRTV, those responses come flooding through very quickly, but they also decay very quickly. I first saw this working many years ago in car insurance, and what you could see was that when you do direct response advertising in car insurance, the responses come through within about 48 hours. After 48 hours, it's died down pretty much to nothing. And because the decays are so fast, there's no build, really. You get a series of blips, but you're not building any long-term growth. If you want long-term growth, what you've got to do is do something different. You've got to build up long-term memories. You've got to do something that changes people's perceptions of the brand and alters their behavior long-term. And that is brand building. Brand building involves creating some kind of permanent change in people's heads, which permanently, or over the long term, biases and influences their behavior so that you get a long-term shift in sales. So often with brand building, the short-term effects are smaller, but the decays are slower, and as a result, successive bursts of brand building activity will ramp up the base level of your sales over time. Now, that's immensely profitable when you get it right, but it takes time. It's a harder job. It takes repeated exposures, repeated conditioning and training of the target audience, so that the payback is over a much longer time period. The other thing to bear in mind about brand building is it's not always, the payback's not always through volume, it's often through price. When you build a strong brand, when you condition people to be positively predisposed towards your brand over the longer term, then what you find is that people are more likely to be willing to pay a higher price for the same product. And that is generally a more profitable thing to do than merely increasing volume. In fact, usually, if you're offered the choice of increasing your volume by 10% or increasing your price by 10%, it's always more profitable to increase your price. Great brand building campaigns do both. They build the base level of your sales over the long term, and they increase price and margins. So they are much more profitable in the long term. Now, you need both kinds of activity, and you need them working together, but there is a tension between them. If you look at the short term, activation effects dominate. So if you look at just sort of 3 to 6 months worth of data, that sort of area of the graph, what you'll see is these short-term spikes, and it appears that activation is doing most of the work. But in fact, if you look at the longer term, sort of 1 to 2 years, what you see is that most of the sales are actually being driven by brand building. So there's this tension between short-term measurement and long-term measurement. Short-term activation, long-term brand building. Now, the truth is you need both because they work together. But of the two, brand building is the main driver of growth. And what we find is it's the main driver of growth for all brands in all categories. So our latest book breaks this stuff down by category, size of brand, price point, and so on. We do not find any examples where the main driver of growth is activation. That short-term stuff is very useful, but the main driver of growth is brand building. This is one of the sort of indicators of that. If you look at the range of different business effects that we track, like sales, market share, price sensitivity, profit, penetration, loyalty, and so on, then they all correlate most strongly with the shifts in brand metrics, not the short-term metrics like direct responses and so on. What matters is not the number of clicks or visits or searches or phone calls that you get. The real driver of long-term business success is that sort of touchy-feely stuff, if you like. Awareness, salience, liking, all those sort of attitudinal measures. If you can build those up over time, if you can build up long-term memories and long-term emotional preference for a brand, that's what drives long-term business success. And that's as true of financial services as any other category. But as I say, you do need both. You need brand building and you need activation because they work together. Again, one of the indicators of this is that what you find is the more that you move the brand metrics, the more that you ramp up the responsiveness to activation. And I've seen this very directly in finance. Lovely little controlled experiment that we did years ago for an insurance brand where we ran TV advertising in some areas of the country, and we tracked the response rates to things like direct mail, for example. And what you could see is in the regions of the country where they ran the TV advertising, the response rates to mailings went up by 70% compared to the regions that had no TV advertising. That's a good example of the way in which the response to direct activity, to activation, is, if you like, influenced by how well predisposed people are and how much they like and know and favor the brand. So think of it that way. You have to prepare people to buy, prepare people to respond. That's brand building. And then you trigger those responses with activation. And when you get that all working together, you can get really strong results. And again, it's just as true in finance as in any other category. Don't think that you can build financial services brands just by doing, what they call hard-working performance marketing. On its own, that stuff does not drive growth. You need to make your performance marketing work well by preparing people with the brand building stuff. So, given that brand building is important in finance as in other categories, how do you do it? How do you maximize effectiveness? So here are some broad principles. The first thing is to remember that it's primarily about penetration, not loyalty. Now, those of you who are familiar with the work of, for example, Andrew Ehrenberg and Byron Sharp will know that in things like fast-moving consumer goods, we know that brand growth is primarily driven by penetration, not loyalty measures like, for example, weight of purchase, frequency of purchase, et cetera, et cetera. And we know from our own research with the IPA that campaigns that follow a penetration-first strategy massively outperform loyalty strategies across all categories. So, but if you go back to sort of the late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of talk in marketing about this, the key to success was brand loyalty. Loyalty is the magic source of effective marketing, which is almost completely nonsense. What we see again and again in the data is that firms that follow a loyalty-first strategy underperform, and as you can see, massively underperform. Penetration-first strategies are about twice as effective overall as loyalty strategies. But the counter that I've had many, many times over the years, and Byron Sharp gets the same, is people saying, well, of course, that's fast-moving consumer goods. We're not selling baked beans here. Financial services are different. And I know in financial services, perhaps more than any other category, has been a category where loyalty marketing has seemed particularly attractive and has been central to the strategies of many finance firms. So a lot of the talk in finance has been about cross-selling and upselling and all those sort of loyalty type measures, which seems attractive because for a start it's cheaper. You don't need to bother to talk to the public in general. You can focus on your existing customers. Rather than doing the difficult and inefficient and hard job of going out there and recruiting customers and expanding your customer base. So clearly, financial services is going to be different. No, it's not. In fact, actually, loyalty strategies underperform in financial services even more than in other categories. Loyalty is important, but it's a secondary consideration, even in finance. And if your company is basing its strategy on loyalty first, loyalty as being the main driver of growth, you are headed for a nasty shock because you are going to underperform and you are going to destroy value for your shareholders. Now, this is very general. We've looked at this for big brands and small brands. We've looked at this for services and goods. We've looked at it for premium brands and cheap brands. There are no examples of categories, brands, or contexts where loyalty strategies are the right thing to do, or at least loyalty first. Loyalty marketing is a huge dead end to a large extent. And what we are seeing is the spurious obsession with loyalty is not nearly as bad as it was, say, 20 years ago. The marketing community is beginning to learn. But as I say, your primary aim should always be to expand your customer base. There is a role for loyalty marketing, but it's a secondary one. But actually, it's broader than that. You need to recruit customers, and you need to get more value from those customers. That means you need to talk to customers and non-customers. And in fact, actually, the most effective strategy of all is not a loyalty strategy or an acquisition strategy. It's a reach strategy. Campaigns that aim to talk to everyone who buys the category tend to be the most effective strategy of all. And this gels with another of our findings. In our previous book, Media in Focus, we looked at the effects of different media. And what we found was that when measuring the overall effectiveness of a medium, about 91% of the variations in media effectiveness can be explained by the reach of the medium. So, and at this point, as Paul Feldwick once said, marketing's actually not that difficult. You need to talk to everyone who buys the category, or in fact, indeed, everyone who might buy the category in the next 2 to 3 years. And you need to make sure you use media that hit all of them. And again, Byron Sharp's work and the work of the team at Ehrenberg Bass suggests that it really does mean everyone. Markets are not nearly as segmented as the teachers in business schools like to tell you. Much of the stuff that's said about segmentation, for example, by Kotler, is not based on empirical evidence. When you look at the data, what you find is that actually there's relatively little segmentation in markets. And for most brands, the optimum strategy is actually to, if you can afford it, to target literally everyone who buys the category. So it's pretty easy, really. You're selling insurance, car insurance, you talk to everyone who might buy car insurance in the next 2 to 3 years, which is all car owners plus a few people who haven't learned to drive yet. Okay, what do you want to do with those people? What's the key message? What's the way you influence them? Well, again, it's kind of simpler than we usually like to think. We love to overcomplicate things. But actually, the main reason people don't buy brands is not that they've considered them and rejected them. It's that those brands never enter the consideration set at all. Just don't think about those brands. They just don't come to mind. And conversely, when a brand does come to mind, you're much more likely to choose it the more easily it comes to mind. So it's what psychologists call mental availability. I was thinking about this in another context, doing some stuff on government advertising. And government campaigns often make the mistake of thinking that it's all about information and persuasion, and that can have perverse effects. For example, anti-drugs advertising can make people consume more drugs, simply because, I can remember actually being, back in my student days, sitting in a flat, and one of those government ads came on about, just say no, and my flatmate sitting next to me said, I could really just go a spliff right now. That is how advertising works. You've got to remember that advertising has far more in common with conditioning, Pavlovian training of animals, than information and persuasion and communication. And every time you advertise, it's like ringing the bell and making the dog salivate, okay? So the first job of marketing is simply to increase the brand's share of mind and to take it along this continuum of mental availability from awareness, which is first base. That's good. People are more likely to choose brands that they've heard of because they are more trusting of things that are familiar. So they will passively accept brands that they know. So if I know Metro Bank, if I have heard of them, I'm more likely to respond to a mailing, for example, from Metro Bank. But actually, that's a fairly weak goal. Much better to salience, if the brand actively pops into your head quite easily and frequently, then that leads to more active shopping. So you want to go from Metro Bank being passively accepted to Metro Bank popping into people's heads the minute they think about a current account, a mortgage, a loan, whatever, so that they actively go out and seek that bank. That's the difference between, accepting a brand when it appears on a price comparison site versus going to the brand's website and bypassing the brand's the price comparison site. That's clearly much more profitable. And then at the top level, if you actually get to the point where people are talking about the brand and, telling their friends about it, or at least talking about the brand's marketing, then you get to the point where the public become part of your sales force, effectively. Now, don't get carried away. People don't, by and large, talk about brands very much. It's quite rare. They don't talk about financial services very much at all. But if you're really lucky, you might get up to that top level and get to the point where you get people working with you. And what we find is that as you move up that scale, you get increasing returns. And I've seen this in finance. So, for example, I've seen it in the life and pensions sector, that as you move up the scale of mental availability, the business results kind of go up exponentially. So the brands that are most famous in each category tend to do disproportionately well. And what we find is that when you get campaigns that really grab the public imagination and are famous and are talked about, of which there can only ever be a few. It's like having a #1 hit record. Only a few people can get to that level. But when you get there, the effect on efficiency is massive. You can quadruple the efficiency of your marketing spend that way. So it's a tough goal, but it's definitely a worthy aim. Now, all of that without anything about the content of the ads. Just mere presence is a good start. But then you need to have something in the ads. And now we get to the tension between messages and emotions. I was struck, there was an article in last week's Economist where it's talking about some linguists have tracked the content of what people say in conversations. And I think the stat was that only about 39%, I think it was, of what people say has any kind of factual content. About 60% of what we say is something else altogether. And just literally before going on stage, I suddenly thought, I've heard that 60-40 rule somewhere else, as you'll see. What we find is that if you're trying to do activation, if you're trying to get an immediate response from people, then it makes sense to go quite rational. You're talking to people in active shopping mode, and you don't want to waste their time or entertain them or charm them or schmooze them. What you want to do is you want to enable them to complete their shopping mission. So, if it's car insurance and I've got to renew my car insurance by Friday, I don't want to be given a whole story about your provenance and purpose and blah, 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 blah. I want to know some very basic things about cover and price and which button do I click on. So the more you go rational, the more you get those short-term activation effects. But for brand building, it's the complete opposite. Remember, brand building is about priming people to be well disposed towards your brand long time before they buy. For some of the people, you will be talking to people who may not come to market for 2 or 3 years. Again, the brand building side of car insurance, the average gap between exposure and sales will be 6 months. So you've got to do things that people will remember 6 months on. Now, 6 months before I renew my car insurance, I have zero interest in car insurance. People are not interested in finance. People find that finance is a unique combination of being boring, complex, and stressful. It's very hard to get people to think about finance because mostly it's about getting to think about something they find very difficult to think about and they don't want to think about. So finance is possibly the very worst category for getting to people to pay attention to messages. They are actively screening you out. And even if you can tell them something about your product, they will have forgotten it in a couple of days' time. So what people do remember is feelings and stories and emotions and jokes and furry animals and children and songs. That's the stuff that people remember, and that's the stuff that sells products in all categories, even in supposedly rational, highly researched categories. Now, this is quite hard for some people to accept. It's particularly hard, I find, for people who come from a mathematical or engineering background to accept. And this may be one of the reasons why finance maybe has a problem with this sort of thing. So you need this combination of the emotional conditioning. And let's go back to that analogy about Pavlov's dog. It's not about telling people about the brand. It's about creating a set of associations and feelings so that when you ring the bell, the dog salivates. When you show the ad or you show the brand, the public gets a warm glow, and they don't know why. And then, when they are interested in that very narrow window, when they finally think, oh, I've got to get a mortgage, I need to think about this, then you have permission to talk to them. But you need to prep that conversation with this, the charm offensive first. It's like good salesmanship. A really good salesman spends 2/3 of the time building up the relationship and doing the charming, and only hits them with the sell at the end. So emotions need to lead, messages follow. Now, another rule related to this is about scale and share of voice. Remember I said that that share of mind is really, really important, and this balance between emotions and messages. And share of mind requires share of voice. The likelihood that a brand comes to mind before it, say if you're NatWest versus Barclays, if NatWest has talked to people more often than Barclays, then all other things being equal, NatWest will come to mind earlier than Barclays. It's quite simple. It's just to do with numbers of exposures. And bear in mind what I said about, penetration versus loyalty. When it's a penetration-led strategy and a reach-led strategy, you need to go very broad. So you need basically many exposures amongst many people. And that requires basically a big weight of spend. What we know is that across many categories around the world, we found this general rule that a brand's share of market tends to correlate with its share of voice. But more importantly, when a brand's share of voice is above its share of market, then it tends to grow over the next couple of years. When a brand's share of voice is below its share of market, it tends to shrink over the next couple of years. And this rule was first discovered actually in the 1960s, but what's interesting, I find, is that there's no evidence that this rule seems to be changing over time, despite all the changes in the media marketplace. And I know this works in finance because I've replicated this sort of research on a number of financial brands over the years. So share of voice is really important. How big your budget is really important, and how you allocate your budget is really important. So this is the 60-40 rule. What we find is that within a given level of budget and a given level of share of voice, the overall effectiveness depends on the mix of brand building and activation. Brands that go hell for leather on brand building underperform slightly. Brands that go hell for leather on activation underperform even more. The sweet spot tends to be about 60% brand building, 40% activation. So we see the overall structure now. You need a big budget, a big share of voice, shout louder than your competitors. You need to primarily devote that budget to long-term emotional priming and brand building, with about 40% of the budget then converting brand equity into sales. So how's it look in finance? Well, before I delve into that, I'm going to talk about how these rules flex for different brands in different categories, which is the subject of the new book. And what we find is that 60-40 rule does vary for different brands in different categories, but it's not quite in the way that you'd expect. Broadly speaking, one of the key principles is if activation is highly efficient, you can actually dial it down. And if brand building is highly efficient, you can actually dial that down. It's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think if a category was very, very responsive to direct mail, you just pile into direct mail. Well, in fact, actually, if you get big responses in your direct activity, you can actually use that efficiency to spend a little less there and focus on the more difficult job. So, for example, what we find is that in high consideration categories where people do a lot of research, activation is highly efficient, and so you can actually spend a little bit less on it. The red there is the activation. So for high consideration categories, 60-40 becomes more like 70-30. Conversely, in categories where people are very emotionally involved, brand building is relatively easy. So you can dial down the brand building component and go for more like a 55-45 split. So how does it work in finance? Well, first of all, think about the share of voice rule. What we find is actually financial services brands are more sensitive to share of voice than most brands are. In fact, more than twice as sensitive. So actually, you don't need to tweak your share of voice quite so much in finance to get a result. Put that round the other way, underspending in finance can be ruinous because your brands are quite sensitive to share of voice. And one of the reasons that share of voice is so efficient in finance is that the activation effects are stronger there. We find that activation effects tend to be stronger for subscription services, for things that are sold online, and for things that are researched online. And finance ticks all three of those boxes. So what we find is activation is very efficient for financial services, and therefore you can dial down the activation in finance. The 60-40 rule becomes closer to 80-20 for financial services. Now that's remarkable. I mean, it is actually, of all the categories and contexts we've looked at, financial services is the one where brand building is most important. Bar none. Nothing else comes close to that 80-20 split. I've got a hunch that most of you who work in finance are not currently allocating your budget that way. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So what does that mean for media? Well, if you're doing activation, the rules seem very clear. Tight targeting, relevant information, and an easy response path. Classic performance marketing. But brand building is almost the complete opposite. You need broad reach rather than tight targeting. You need emotional power rather than relevant messages. And you need to do stuff that's memorable rather than stuff that people will respond to there and then. And what we find is that video tends to produce the best results for brand building. There is something about pictures are more emotive than words. Moving pictures are more emotive than still pictures. And anything with music works better than stuff without music. Music is tremendously important. For TV ads, 20 to 30% of the selling power can come from the choice of music, which tells you something about how brand building works. This is, again, it's not communication. It's conditioning. And so we find that for online advertising, video works best, and for offline advertising, video works best, whether that's TV or digital outdoor. Sorry, Matt. Let's now remind ourselves about the shape of media consumption in Britain today. This is the data that came out in October from Touchpoints, the IPA survey that gives consumption of media on a like-for-like basis across the UK. It's probably the only source that I know of that really gives comparable data for all different media on a like-for-like basis, not just in the UK. I mean, I don't know of anything else quite like this around the world. This chart shows weekly reach. Remember, reach is about 91% of media effectiveness, and then hours per day along the bottom there. And of course, as you can see, nobody watches TV anymore. So we can discount that. There has been a slight drop in TV viewing in recent years, but the biggest story is actually how little it has dropped over the last 40 years. So if you have a sort of dynamic version of this chart, it's sort of slowly dropping, but it's still the medium that people spend most time with. What we're all constantly told, of course, is that everyone just watches Netflix, which is here. Netflix is, for example, I don't know, about a third of the size of radio. But it's growing very fast. But people in advertising and marketing massively overestimate the amount of time that people spend watching online video and subscriber VOD, and massively underestimate the amount of exposure to things like broadcast TV, radio, out of home, and so on. So if you want reach and you want emotion, then you'd be an idiot to ignore the top right corner there. But what smart marketers do is they use online and offline together. We find that particularly online video and offline video together are a very powerful combination. So an Adam and Eve presentation wouldn't be an Adam and Eve presentation without some mention of John Lewis. It's actually built into my contract, I have to mention them. And John Lewis, for me, I mean, in many ways it's very old-fashioned, but in many ways it's also absolutely the paradigm of 21st century marketing, I believe. So what we have is big, emotional brand building, particularly at Christmas, using a combination of online and offline media, very heavily focused on video. And then that's supported by activation throughout the year, which converts that into sales. This is for the Christmas advertising for 2012 to 2016. I haven't got the 2017 and 18 data yet, but I'm a bit slow. I don't do real-time evaluation. This is the online video. And this is what great online video looks like. I mean, we're talking about 60, 70 million views in a period of 6 weeks, just in the UK, basically. And most of that is organic, very little paid for. That's tremendously efficient, tremendously good at spreading the message of the campaign. But you need to put it in the wider context. This is the same data, but adding on the TV. So that's the online down there. Almost all of the views are on TV. We are talking about now getting close to 1 billion views each Christmas through TV. About half of it is the brand part of the campaign, and about half of it is, sorry, I've done that the other way around. About half of it is the brand part of the campaign, but there's also a chunk of there which is supplier TV, which is a more direct DRTV approach, which is paid for by the individual suppliers. So, yes, this stuff is a nice multiplier. The online video is a nice multiplier, but almost all of the sales, 95% of the sales, come from the TV. And what that does is it just adds that little fame multiplier. So, use online video, use TV, use them together, but don't forget where the big money lies. And those synergies between online and offline are making everything work harder. There's been a lot of bollocks talked over the last 20 years about TV is dying and, TV advertising no longer works. I can remember having a conversation about this. I think it was about 14 or 15 years ago, being told that TV advertising was dead, and I probably shouldn't be talking about it anymore. Shouldn't be standing up on stage and being a dinosaur saying that TV advertising works. Well, it does, and our evidence suggests that the effects of adding TV to your media mix have actually increased over time. And it's not just me saying it, so other studies, econometric studies, suggest that the ROI from TV has actually increased over time. That may change. There is a bit of softening of TV viewing, but so far, TV is the most powerful tool the marketers have, and there is no sign that it's losing its edge yet. So smart marketers use all the tools, all the old tools and all the new tools together in harmony, in synergy, to get the maximum effect. So this should be the golden age of marketing, really. We've got better tools than ever before, but something is going wrong. What we find is actually over the last few years, since the financial crisis, while the potential effectiveness of marketing has increased, the actual results of marketing campaigns have got smaller. And there's one category that has really screwed things up more than any other. Well done, financial services. The biggest loss of effectiveness of any category. And as you'll see, the loss of effectiveness correlates very strongly with the shift to short-term strategies. Financial services have just gone really short-term, and as a result, they've really dented their effectiveness. And again, we see this in the brand activation mix. What this shows is the deviation from the optimum brand activation split. And what we see is that since the financial crash, financial services has massively cut back on long-term brand building in favor of short-term activation. And that is denting your profits. I'm sure during the panel session we'll speculate about why that was, and I'm not entirely sure why it is, but something is clearly going wrong in financial services marketing. And frankly, you guys need to sort yourselves out. But there is a way out of this. So this is an example. This is not quite financial services, but I think you can see the analogy. So this is the work that we did for the AA. We wrote an IPA effectiveness paper on this last autumn. Won a prize for it last autumn. Quick thumbnail sketch. We all know the AA, one of the most famous, most established and best loved brands in Britain. But about, I think 5 to 8 years ago, something like that, they had the bright idea of cutting all the brand building to zero and just doing hard-working performance marketing. Initially, through things like direct mail, but then they realized that wasn't very efficient either, so they just piled into digital direct response stuff. Cut the budgets right back, got great ROIs on the small amount of spend that they put into the brand, and pursuing a strategy which basically was to hook people in with offers and discounts, then hike the prices up at renewal time and then make money out of them that way. And this appeared to be an extremely profitable strategy until they looked at the long-term trends. And they saw that all the brand metrics were in free fall. An increasing percentage of the public had no idea who the AA were. The ones who were customers were increasingly pissed off at being ripped off, and were leaving in droves unless they were offered even bigger discounts, which was eroding the margins. And really nice little paradox. Short-term ROI was better than it had ever been, and they did a projection and said, and in 5 to 6 years, we will be out of business. That shows the perils of focusing on short-term metrics. In 5 to 6 years, the size of the customer base would have shrunk to the point where the business would no longer be viable. So they read a couple of books by some guys called Binet and Field. I don't know who they are. And they had this brilliant idea of hiking their share of voice above their market share, reallocating the budget 60-40, and doing a nice little telly ad. Now, arguably, there is a proposition in there. I don't know how many of you clocked what the proposition was. I don't think many members of the public did. What people responded to was a great song and a cute singing baby. And remember, that's the stuff that sells things. This is what happened to their market share. That ad turned a 5-year decline in market share around in a single year. Marketing's not that difficult. You need a shed load of telly, a great song, and a singing baby. That might actually be a pretty good conclusion in itself. But I felt I had to do a rather wordy chart, which even I can't be bothered to read. But basically, financial services follows the same rules as other categories. You're not different. Brand building is the main driver. Activation is secondary. And in fact, actually, because activation is so easy and so efficient in your category, you can afford to dial that bit down. Stop spamming people with programmatic and emails and mailings and stuff like that, and actually engage people at the emotional level with that kind of thing. And when you get that right, the results can be massive. So you need to reverse what you've done over the last few years. You need to stop going hell for leather in favor of hard-working performance marketing and put a bit more emotion and feeling and humanity into the brands. Thank you.